Hey everyone, welcome to the first sideboard tech video on this channel by yours truly, Delver Brews. I've been wanting to do this for a while, so as you know, I put out deck techs every week or every other week, and in those deck techs I go over, I go through the details of a deck, how it's built, how you play it, and I spent some time on the sideboards, but I've had a lot of feedback on people that want me to dive a bit deeper into sideboards, and I feel like doing that for each deck tech might become really repetitive. So instead I'm thinking of releasing a series of videos on sideboard tech, essentially. So, the type of sideboard tools that you have at your disposal in a particular color combination, in a particular format. So today I'm going to be going through Temur in Modern and looking at the common sideboard tech that you have at your disposal. But before I do, I want to go through a quick disclaimer because I think it's going to be important before we go forward. So number one, this is not going to include every single card that's possible in Temur as a sideboard tool. Alright, there's 10,000 plus legal modern cards. I'm obviously going to miss a bunch of them, and for each one that I bring up in this video, I'm sure you could think of 10 others. The point of this video is to bring up common ones that we currently see in the meta, and in particular the ones that I use most often in decks. So that's going to cut out a lot of the type of cards that you might see in a video like this if you want it to be a 2-hour long video. Number two is I'm focusing on cards that are mostly seen in sideboards. That means cards like Scavenging Ooze or Magus of the Moon that do see sideboard play, more often than not see main board play. So you usually see Scavenging Ooze in the main board and less so on the sideboard. So those type of cards are not going to show up on this list. Again, it's mostly for brevity, or else this is going to be a 2-hour long video, and I really don't want that. Plus screen real estate is going to be a problem. Number three, my analysis is based on the color combination in question. So in today's video, it's going to be Temur. So if I'm talking about Dismember, for example, I'm going to be talking about Dismember in the Temur context today. I'm not going to be talking about Dismember in a Jund context or a Sultai context or, in some other context. And last but not least, not really a disclaimer, but I would love to hear from you in the comment section down below. Any cards that I miss or something that you think I should have covered that I didn't. This is the first video in the series, so I really want to, get it right quickly. So your feedback is important. Alright, so let's start with Artifact and Enchantment hate. So we're in Temur and we want to deal with artifacts and enchantments. So Modern has a few enchantments roaming around right now that I've seen. There's As Foretold, there's some other enchantments that are going to pop up, but realistically speaking, you're mostly concerned about artifacts. So a lot of the hate that we have at our disposal that are really common right now are artifact centric. Cards that I'm not too keen on, but I include in this video, are Natural State. My main reason why I don't like Natural State is the restriction of converted mana cost 3 or less. What's nice is that it's a 1 CMC card and it's instant speed, and that's all great. It's cheap, it's efficient. The limitation is really on the converted mana cost, and you want to be targeting Batter Skulls and Wormcoil Engines and a bunch of artifacts that are going to be at least 4 CMC, 5 CMC, 6 CMC and on. And the same holds true for a lot of the enchantments. So yeah, you could probably hit As Foretold, but you're probably going to miss Leyline of Sanctity or Leyline of the Void or, other cards like that. So Natural State for me really works in a deck where you need to be hyper efficient with your mana, or you're in a meta that you're not really afraid of artifacts and enchantments that are more expensive, or this is just part of a larger artifact hate package within your sideboard. And I guess in that case it would make sense. Ancient Grudge is more of a favorite of mine. I don't run it right now in a lot of my decks, but Ancient Grudge is always great because of its flashback. So Ancient Grudge is two CMCs, 1 red and a colorless, to destroy target artifact, and it has a flashback cost of 1 green, and that's really what makes Ancient Grudge so awesome, is that you can cast it and then you can flash it back from your graveyard at any time after to to repeat its effect again. And it's a 2-for-1 essentially, where it's 2 artifacts for 3 mana essentially, and it has a lot of power there. You running it is really going to depend on, again, what you're trying to fight in your meta. If you are in a super heavy artifact meta, or if you feel like in whatever LGS, a lot of people are running artifact card, like artifact decks, then Ancient Grudge might be a good option because, you know, again, you can get 2 artifacts with 1 card, and you can run multiple Ancient Grudges, and, you know, then it kind of rebounds from there. So that's when I would really look at Ancient Grudge as an option. Moving on to Destructive Revelry. So Destructive Revelry is great because you could eat an enchantment or an artifact, and you also deal 2 damage to that permanent's controller. So it's pretty cool there. I mean, the downside, in you know, let's say compared to Ancient Grudge, is that you need red and green, so it's slightly more restrictive in mana, although arguably it's not that bad. And you're only doing it once. So unless you have a Snapcaster Mage in your deck or some other way to flash this back, you're only casting it once, and then it's done. But it might work for you. You know, it's 2 more damage. That's going to help you, you know, potentially kill off your opponent, and that's always a good thing. So again, if you're worried about enchantments, then Destructive Revelry, I think, becomes the better card to choose in comparison to definitely Natural State, but also Ancient Grudge. Cindervines, I actually like Cindervines. It's nice because, you know, you get to target an artifact or enchantment whenever you want, and it also deals 2 damage to that enchantment's to that artifact or enchantment's controller. So it's kind of a Destructive Revelry on an enchantment. But what's really cool is its first ability. So whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, Cindervines deals 1 damage to it. So that essentially kills Storm or any kind of deck that, you know, is stacking a lot of spells. So that's always a good thing. I'm happy about that. It's kind of funny against Burn too, although I think it's a bit too cute to bring in against Burn because you're not going to be killing anything else with it. It's, you know, you're not going to be destroying any of Burn's artifacts and enchantments that they don't play. So I mean, it doesn't really work there. So I would choose this if Storm is really a big thing, or whatever, any kind of, you know, deck that really casts a lot of spells often, that just kind of pummels through them. This is a great way to kind of deal with those decks if artifacts and enchantments are also a concern. You know, that you have to keep that in mind. But I really like Cindervines because of that effect. But you do remember, you're paying for that extra ability. So you got to pay a green and a red to cast it, and then you got to pay 1 more colorless to actually get the destruction ability. So keep that in mind. There's a cost benefit analysis you have to do there. Wilt is the newer player on the block. It's just a standard destroy target artifact or enchantment for a green and a colorless. We can compare this to Ancient Grudge. We can compare this to Destructive Revelry more accurately. It is less mana restrictive, and it does target an artifact enchantment, pure and simple. There's no restrictions there, and it has a cycling ability. So it's happened to me many times where I bring in, let's say, 2 Ancient Grudges or whatever. I bring in a bunch of artifact hate, and I draw too many, and all of a sudden now I'm stuck with a bunch that I don't really need anymore. So the Wilt's cycling ability is actually pretty good. You could get rid of it for 2 and then, you know, draw a card. I think there is some utility there. I think Wilt is seeing a lot of play, and yeah, it might be a pretty good option. But let's get to Abrade. So Abrade, it took me a while to warm up to Abrade because I didn't like the fact that it was restrictive on just artifacts. But the fact is, Abrade also targets creatures with 3 damage, right? So it's a lightning bolt for creatures. So you choose, and I like that because there are plenty of times where I bring in Abrade to deal with creature decks. I'm not worried about artifacts. I'm just worried about bringing in extra removal to get rid of creatures. So that's awesome. So there's some crossover there. And if I'm not worrying about creatures, I'm worrying about artifacts, well, then I can deal with them as well with Abrade. And again, it's also 2 CMC, 1 red, 1 colorless, kind of like Ancient Grudge. So in many ways, yeah, you can't flash it back, but because it's flexible in terms of, you know, do you want to destroy an artifact or do you want to probably kill a creature in Modern? I would value Abrade definitely over Ancient Grudge at this point. Again, if you are in an artifact heavy meta, then things kind of change because Ancient Grudge can kill more artifacts, right, with 1 card. But I think Abrade right now is my main go-to artifact killer. And last but not least, I brought this up because I don't necessarily play with Back to Nature, but I do see some decks packing it in their sideboard. Destroy all enchantments. You really need to be in a special situation where you are afraid of enchantments so much that you need a card like this. So this is more of a nuke. You would have to have this in your sideboard as well as artifact hate cards, because this doesn't touch artifacts. And I didn't include cards like Shatterstorm, for example, that can you can destroy multiple artifacts as well. I didn't bring that in because we're not really running that right now in the meta, but Back to Nature does see some play, so I included it here. Again, I'm not sure if we're really concerned about this. You're probably bringing this in if you're like if you're playing some sort of combo deck in Temur and you're afraid of, I don't know, Leyline of Sanctity or Leyline of the Void or something. Then I would understand you bring Back to Nature into your sideboard, but I don't know, keep that in mind. I wanted to include it there because we have a lot of cards here that focus a lot on artifacts. There are cards that are available to us that focus purely on enchantments, but I think it's a bit heavy-handed in my opinion. Alright, land hate. I love to hate on lands. So when you're in Temur, there are a lot of decks that are going to give you trouble because you don't have black removal. So decks that kind of ramp into really big creatures like Tron are a problem for you. And I know that's one of the reasons, not all the reasons, that's one of the reasons why you would run land hate in your sideboard. Another reason is that for whatever reason, I don't know if it's just how the shards and the wedges align, Temur seems to be very well suited to play a card like Blood Moon. I've tried to pinpoint exactly why that's the case, and I'm not sure yet, but it's just a fact. If you want to play Blood Moon, Temur, in terms of 3-color combinations in Modern, in Magic, but in Modern in particular, is probably one of the best colors you can play. So, or sorry, one of the best combos you can play. So, yeah, this is why we want to bring in Land Hate, is to punish decks like Tron, or Eldrazi, or E-Tron, is to also punish decks that are just greedy with their mana base. So Junda's there, you know, UB decks are there, so blue-black decks tend to be very greedy with their mana somehow, even though they're only running 2 colors. They all run all their fetches and all their other stuff, I mean, all their shocks, and they don't usually go for their basics. Blood Moon will definitely penalize them for that. I bring in Blood Moon against mill decks because, you know what, turning them off black or blue early on can pretty much screw their whole game plan. So, you know, these types of cards have a lot of utility outside of big mana decks like Tron, but you're usually most often bringing them in for those types of decks. So let's start with Alpine Moon. So you bring in Alpine Moon if you are squeamish about running Blood Moon. That's how it is. That might be the case depending on the type of Temur deck you're playing. So if you're playing a Temur deck that is greedy on lands, you're not running a lot of basics, you know, for whatever reason you're running a lot of, you know, specialty non-basic lands, then Alpine Moon is a bit more surgical. So you play it, you cast it, and you target a specific land that you want to essentially turn into, not a mountain in this case, into a land that produces any one color, but it's going to lose all of its abilities, and that's the important part. So Alpine Moon is your surgical Blood Moon, and that's how I would play it. But if you can play Blood Moon and your mana base is sculpted, and a lot of my Temur decks are sculpted like that, of course, then I would play Blood Moon over Alpine Moon any day. Cleansing Wildfire is the new kid to the block. I actually like it, even though I haven't played a lot with it yet. I do actually like the concept of paying 2 mana, 1 red, 1 colorless, destroy a target land, and the opponent was going to go search for basics, so they are going to replace it. But the point is, you're not playing this to cut them off of mana, you're playing this to cut them off a specific land. So if you're playing against Tron, you're going to target one of the Urza lands, or if you're playing against humans, you might target Cavern of Souls, or you might just target Cavern of Souls in general. Whatever it is, you're getting rid of a land that's specifically causing you headaches. And what's nice about it is that you also draw a card. So that's pretty cool. So yes, the downside is your opponent can replace that land that you're destroying, although oftentimes they won't because they're not running enough basics. But the upside is that you're also drawing a card, and it's 1 mana less than Molten Rain, which we'll get to in a minute. So that's why I would play Cleansing Wildfire in those type of situations, especially in a deck where you want more cantrips. So that's definitely a bonus. Up next is Spreading Seas. So Spreading Seas has been around for a while, since the original Zendikar. Actually never been reprinted, which is interesting. And kind of like Cleansing Wildfire, it's a bit more surgical, so you are taking out 1 land. In this case, that land is not being destroyed and it's not being replaced. It's simply losing all of its abilities and it's becoming an island. And what's nice is that you also cantrip off of Spreading Seas, so you draw a card, which is great overall. I don't necessarily run Spreading Seas in decks that can run Blood Moon, obviously, because Blood Moon is just better overall. But in a situation where you can't play Blood Moon, Spreading Seas is actually a pretty decent option. Now, usually Merfolk play Spreading Seas because of the island walk that a lot of their, or all their Merfolk eventually get, which is very annoying. And of course, if you play Spreading Seas on your opponent's lands, they all of a sudden have an island, and then boom, no one can block their Merfolk. So, I mean, that's where you often see Spreading Seas, but it's perfectly normal. It's perfectly normal and okay to play it in any other deck as well. If you feel like this is a type of land hate that you prefer to play, or maybe you can't afford Blood Moons, although I think Spreading Seas is relatively expensive, or whatever reason, you know, Spreading Seas is also cheaper. It's also more mana efficient in a way. So if you don't necessarily need a complete sweeper for lands like Blood Moon, Spreading Seas is your way to go. Now let's get to Blood Moon. Oh, I love Blood Moon. Who doesn't love Blood Moon? Well, I guess if you're Tron, you don't love Blood Moon. But I really love Blood Moon. I mean, what else can you say? Non-basic lands are mountains. So basically, any land that's not a basic is now a mountain. It loses all of its abilities. Fetches don't fetch. You know, dual lands don't produce dual colors. They're all producing red. This is your nuke, essentially, for lands. This is what cancels everything out, and no matter what your opponent does, if they don't get rid of Blood Moon, their lands are doing nothing at all. There are no effects, no enter the battlefield effects, nothing. So if you can't play Blood Moon, play Blood Moon. It's going to take out Tron decks. It's going to take out Jund, which is what I often bring in against. Honestly, any mid-range deck, 3-color deck, I almost certainly bring in Blood Moon. I usually pay attention to the type of lands that my opponent is fetching for in game 1, and if I notice that they're often fetching for non-basics, I almost certainly bring in Blood Moon. You know, with Astrolabe getting banned, the snow lands, the snow basics have kind of gone away a bit in a lot of decks, so Blood Moon's prevalence has come back, which is great for someone who loves Blood Moon like me. So again, I mean, pay attention. If you are running Blood Moon in your sideboard, pay attention to game 1, see the type of lands your opponents are playing. If you feel like they are relatively greedy, then bring in Blood Moon. I usually, and I know this is going to go against what I just said before, I usually don't bring in Blood Moon for decks that play 2 colors. That being said, pay attention to the fetches. If your opponent is fetching greedily, bring in Blood Moon and punish them. That's usually what I do. If you're playing against a monocolored, if you're playing against a 1-color deck, then almost certainly Blood Moon is going to be useless, unless for whatever reason they are heavily relying on non-basic lands to do some weird combo annoyance, in which case Blood Moon then all of a sudden becomes relevant, because yes, you're not going to turn off their basic lands, but you're going to turn off their non-basic lands that are potentially integral to whatever the deck is trying to do. So again, it's really a judgment call on your end when you're playing a card like Blood Moon. And of course, you're playing 4 colors or 5 colors, which is a lot more rare. Bring it in, because that day your opponent has no chance. With Astrolabe gone, they have no chance. Molten Rain. There are a few cards that have the Molten Rain-like effect. I included Molten Rain here just because it's just common, but there's Pillage and other cards that you can bring in that essentially do the same thing. So destroy target land. If the land was non-basic, Molten Rain deals 2 damage to that land's controller. You're almost certainly always destroying a non-basic land, so you're almost always certainly dealing 2 damage to that to your opponent. And yeah, again, this is more of a, you know, surgical, target one specific land, and also deal damage. Again, this works in decks that either can't run Blood Moon or are also running Blood Moon and you're just doing full-on land destruction. So Ponza sees this a lot in sideboards. You know, again, I included it here because I feel it would be wrong to not include it. I personally don't really play with Molten Rain that much. It really depends on what, especially if you're in Temur. Again, we're talking about Temur here. If you're playing Temur, I don't see where Molten Rain really fits, but it is an option, and I have seen it played, and I think it's important to at least bring it up because you have Molten Rain. And I mean, Pillage does a similar effect. It doesn't deal 2 damage. It just says that the land can't be regenerated, I believe. Don't crucify me if that's wrong. Last but not least, Crumble to Dust. So let's read Crumble to Dust because you don't see it often, but it does exist, and it's still in Modern to this day. Exile target non-basic land. Search its controller's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with that same name as that land and exile them. So essentially you're basically saying, I hate this land and I hate it so much, I want all copies of it gone from the game. That's some serious hate for 4 mana, but keep in mind, you're still only targeting 1 land and it's 4 mana. So unless you're ramping in to this card so you could cast it on turn 3 or turn 2, which would be crazy, I'd be weary about running this card, at least in Temur. Your better option is most likely Blood Moon, and it's really why I wanted to bring Crumble to Dust here, because I'm sure a lot of you would bring it up. I think it's cool in that it also has the Void, so it kind of dodges some sort of weird counters, but not really in Modern. The main point here is you're getting rid of, let's say, Urza's Mine, and it's gone for good. All of the Urza's Mines your opponent's control. So in a way, even if, in that sense, it's better than Blood Moon because your opponent can destroy Blood Moon, and then all of a sudden all their lands come back online. Whereas this is pretty much definitive. I'm taking Urza's power plant and all of your other power plants, and they're gone. In which case your opponent will never assemble Tron. That's pretty powerful. Or you can target, Eldrazi Temple. Take out all the Eldrazi Temples, although I feel like that's a weak option to target, and then your opponent can't really ramp into their Eldrazi spells. So this is where you bring in Crumble to Dust. I feel like it would have to be a pretty intense meta for you to consider Crumble to Dust in Temur, but it is an option. It can be played. Listen, you're playing green, so there are plenty of Temur decks that play Noble Hierarch, Arbor Elf, whatever it may be, so you could ramp into it. If you could reliably cast this turn 3 because of ramp, then I think it's fine, because if you're targeting a Tron land, it's essentially Blood Mooning your Tron opponent, because that's it, it's gone. Like, it doesn't turn off all their other annoying lands, but their main ramp is gone. So that pretty much does it for land hate. Let's move on. So, graveyard hate. Yeah, graveyard hate. The first thing that comes to mind is Dredge, at least for me, but I call it not magic, as you've seen in my previous videos. I usually refer to Dredge as not magic because it's not magic, let's be serious. You don't just have graveyard hate for Dredge though, right? So let's look at our graveyard hate options. And yes, I know there are many other options you could choose from, but I'm bringing in the most common ones. Tormod's Crypt. Of the graveyard hate cards that exist, I feel like Tormod's Crypt is probably the weakest one. What's the real benefit of Tormod's Crypt is that it's free, so it's 0 mana, and it's an artifact, so it helps in growing your Tarmogoyfs if you're playing your Tarmogoyf in your Temur deck, which I hope you are. And you're exiling all cards from target player's graveyard, so it's a one-time target your opponent's graveyard, and that's it. Again, for a free artifact that does that, it's not bad, and depending on what type of decks you're expecting to play against, it's perfectly okay to have it. You keep it on the battlefield, maybe even turn 1, and your opponent's going to have to double, they're going to definitely work around Tormod's Crypt, because they know at any time you can crack it and, destroy their graveyard. And obviously you're bringing this against a deck that relies on your graveyards. So this is relevant against Dredge, it's relevant against Euro decks, it's relevant against technically Storm decks, any kind of weird combo deck that relies on bringing back cards from their graveyard. All of that is legitimate, and Tormod's Crypt can fit that role. But you could say that for basically all the cards on the screen. So let's look at Surgical Extraction. So Surgical Extraction, in its name, it's surgical. It's very specific. You are waiting for a specific card to hit the graveyard, and once it does, you cast Surgical Extraction, you get rid of it. And you not only do you get rid of it, you get rid of it from your opponent's hand, you get it from the opponent's library as well. So as long as that card is not cast on the battlefield, you're getting rid of it from the game, and that can be detrimental to your opponent. So, Dredge, that could be a problem because you could slow them down significantly, especially if you cast multiple Surgical Extractions. Euro, obviously if you get rid of Uro, sorry, I should say Uro, then Uro's gone, and that might be the main finisher for a control deck. So yeah, Surgical Extraction, obviously a combo deck, so if you manage to, let's say, counter a combo piece, you can then surgically extract it from the graveyard to make sure it never comes back. So there are a lot of ways you can play Surgical Extraction. I posted up a match earlier this week where I beat a stupid Restore Balance deck because I got rid of their only remaining win conditions. So, or else I would have lost. So, screw them. Surgical Extraction is great. I think it has a lot of relevance in the current meta, and I actually usually have at least one copy in my sideboard. Grafdigger's Cage, good old Grafdigger's Cage, you can always rely on it. It pretty much shuts down most of the things you are afraid of from graveyards, and it has the added benefit of libraries. So let's read it really quick. Creature cards and graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield, so that targets Dredge, that targets any deck that's playing Collected Company. It's stopping all of those decks. It's stopping all of those decks from doing anything interesting. Combo decks as well. They're all stopped. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. Again, can't cast a spell from a graveyard, can't cast a spell from your library. That shuts down Dredge, it shuts down a lot of combo decks. Very, very relevant. If I'm usually running a split between Surgical Extraction and Grafdigger's Cage, it's usually how I field, and then I play those two cards. I think it's a great option in this current meta and most metas. Grafdigger's Cage is an awesome card. There's a reason why it's relatively expensive, even though it's been reprinted quite a few times. Relic of Progenitus is very common as well. I understand why, because it has the exile ability, which also allows you to draw a card. I get it. It's obviously functionally way better than Tormod's Crypt, and I would almost certainly play it over Tormod's Crypt, unless you needed, a lot of zero cast spells or artifacts. Relic of Progenitus is great because if you get it down early on, every turn you're going to be tapping it. Your opponent's going to have to get rid of a card in their graveyard. And when the moment's right, you pay one, you exile it, and then all the cards are gone. From all graveyards, keep that in mind. So it's also your graveyard that's being targeted in that case. But you also draw a card, so I guess it's cool. It's not my cup of tea, but I wouldn't say that Relic of Progenitus is bad. I mean, it's played a lot. I even think it's played more than Grafdigger's Cage. Or at least at one point it was. So Relic of Progenitus is a pretty good sideboard option for graveyard hate. It really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're really worried about. Soul Guide Lantern, again, a newer player to the block. Let's quickly read it. When Soul Guide Lantern enters the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard. So it has an ETB effect. You're already exiling a card from a graveyard. Not super important. It's not like you're doing it instant speed, right? But it's a cool effect. You also have tap, sacrifice a Soul Guide Lantern, exile each opponent's graveyard. So it's a one-time exiling each of your opponent's graveyards. Or pay one, sacrifice Soul Guide Lantern, draw a card. So it has a bit more flexibility in what you can do. I really prefer graveyard hate cards that just hate on the graveyard. I don't need it to do a million other things. I just need to stop the graveyard. That's all I really need. Drawing a card and all that, when it's gone, it's kind of like defeating its purpose, right? Unless you're killing your opponent that turn. But if you're playing Temur, your games are often going to grind out more often than not. So I feel like these artifacts that sacrifice to get rid of the cards in the graveyard are not as useful. And I mean, Soul Guide Lantern, I guess, is an improvement over some of the other options, but I think it's more cute than anything else. Last but not least, I had to mention Ashiok Dreamrender. I mean, let's look at its ability, its passive ability here. So spells and abilities your opponents control can cause their controller to search their library, which is great in Modern where there's fetching and a whole bunch of other tutoring. So that's already pretty cool, and I mean, there's some crossover there, right? So you can bring this in against decks that heavily rely on that. So let's keep that in mind. There is that ability. You're not just bringing it in for its -1 ability, which is pretty brutal. So target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard and then exile each opponent's graveyard. That's pretty brutal, because not only are you exiling your opponent's graveyard, you're milling them 4 cards first. So you're getting rid of cards that they may need, and you're doing that 5 times. That's a lot. That's a lot of cheddar. It's 20 cards if Ashiok Dreamrender survives, and not to mention all the other cards you're exiling at the same time. So yeah, that's Ashiok Dreamrender is like a nuclear bomb for the graveyard, in my opinion. The only real downside is that you have to wait till turn 3 to cast it, and it has a double blue requirement. So in Temur, you're going to need double blue to cast it on turn 3. That might be difficult. It really depends on what you're trying to do. So there is some downside to Ashiok Dreamrender, which is why I don't always play it. But it's definitely a card that you should heavily consider. And if you feel like it's something that you can do easily in your Temur deck, keep it in your sideboard, have a 1 of or a 2 of, or just make it your only sideboard, make it your only graveyard hate card in your sideboard, to have 2 or 3 of them. And I think you have a winning strategy there. So let's get to creature hate. And creature hate, yeah, there are so many options. Now you're in Temur colors, so you essentially don't have any spells that specifically say destroy target creature. That's not what red, green, or blue does, generally speaking. That's not true, because there is Pongify, for example, which I did not include in this list. So Pongify does say destroy target creature, but you're replacing it with another creature I didn't really include it here, but maybe I should have. But as you can see, I'm running out of screen real estate, so I didn't. Plus, no one really plays Pongify except me, because I think it's hilarious playing Pongify in a deck that also plays Hooting Mandrills. But anyway, I digress. Let's go through the creature hate cards, because there's a lot of them, and it's a mix. There's single target removal, and there is sweepers that I included in the same list. And I think that's important. So Engineered Explosives is kind of your catch-all. So keep in mind, Engineered Explosives will sweep essentially creatures of a particular CMC, or any permanent, actually, of a particular CMC, and it does have crossover with other types of hate that you might want to bring in. So you might hate artifacts, you might hate enchantments, whatever other, you might hate planeswalkers. Engineer Explosives technically can hit all of them, but keep in mind you're playing Temur, so you could only target CMC up to 3, right? Because you have green, blue, red. So keep that in mind. I like Engineered Explosives for hitting on tokens. If you're playing a deck that generates a lot of tokens, you cast Engineered Explosives for 0, and then you pay 2 mana, and you destroy all the tokens. That's really easy, and you're almost certainly not going to hit anything that you're playing. Or you could use it as more of a nuclear bomb, again, to take out, like humans play a lot of 1 CMC spell, 1 CMC creatures, kill them all. Or, elves do the same thing, burn does the same thing. So Engineered Explosives come in handy if you feel you're playing a deck that goes too wide, too quickly, and you can't deal with it. Goblins is another good example. I wouldn't necessarily play 2 or 3 or 4. I definitely don't want to play 4. But 1 or 2 of in your sideboard can come in handy. Flame Slash. It deals 4 damage to target creature. That's, a lot of damage. It can take out quite a few creatures in Modern. And it's a 1-of. It's a sorcery, so it's not the best option you have. But it is an option. So if you want damage-based removal, but you want something that's better than Lightning Bolt, Flame Slash is actually a pretty cool option there for you. And if you need sorceries, if you need more card types in your graveyard and you don't have a lot of sorceries, Flame Slash is also an option. Now I included Vapor Snag in here because I think it is a legitimate card you can run if you're playing, let's say, a tempo-based Temur deck, which is usually common when you're playing Temur in Modern. So Vapor Snag is pretty good. It's played in this main board as well, but a lot of it is in the sideboard. Bounce a creature to their opponent's hand, deal them a damage, and you just pray that you're killing your opponent next turn. That's essentially what you're doing with Vapor Snag, where you're getting rid of their creature for temporary reprieve so you can do something else. That's what Vapor Snag does. Pyroclasm is your sweeper. It deals 2 damage to each creature indiscriminately, which is perfectly fine. I played Pyroclasm for a long time. The only real reason I don't play it that often right now is because it'll hit a lot of creatures that are 2 toughness or less. So if I'm playing Delver of Secrets, it's going to kill my Delver of Secrets. If I'm playing Noble Hierarch, it's going to kill my Noble Hierarch. But if you're not playing creatures at that level, all your creatures are bigger, include Pyroclasm, because Pyroclasm will be really, it'll be a catastrophe from many aggro decks in Modern that go wide. Goblins, Burn, you name it. Any of those type of decks that go wide quickly. Humans even, although humans, they're kind of annoying with their boosting abilities. Pyroclasm is pretty good. Entrancing Melody is also an option you have in Temur if you want to be a bit more cute. If you are running more than 17 or 18 lands, Entrancing Melody might be a pretty good option here because you're not destroying a creature, you're just gaining control of it. And that could be pretty detrimental, right? You could target any creature. That includes token creatures. So, take your pick. Token creatures are not really a big concern right now. But, yeah, I mean, if you want to steal a creature instead, and I have matches where I've played Entrancing Melody and I steal a creature and I win the game, like stealing Death's Shadow, which is hilarious. Yeah, I mean, Entrancing Melody is perfectly legitimate as a creature hate card, although it's a creature stealing card and a creature hate card in reality. Echoing Truth, again, I was kind of contemplating including it in here. I probably should have included something else, honestly, but again, in terms of seeing play, Echoing Truth does still see play in Modern, and again, this is going to be coming in handy against decks that are playing a lot of tokens with the same name. Get rid of all of them. That's really great. That's usually why I would even play it in the sideboard. If you're concerned about tokens in your meta, then Echoing Truth comes in a bit more handy there. But keep in mind, it says target non-land permanent. So it's not just creatures, although I included it in this category. It's any permanent. So that could come in handy as well if you're playing against a non-creature deck that, although I would say that you have better options. If you want to get rid of an artifact or an enchantment, well then Echoing Truth works. If you want to get rid of a Planeswalker, it works. But Echoing Truth is, I consider it more of a sweeper. It's the only real reason, because you're targeting a permanent, and that's going away, and all other permanents with the same name are going away. So that's why I include it here. Dismember is a favorite. I mean, listen, it's a free card. I mean, free in the sense that you don't, I mean, you're paying 4 life, but it's doing -5 to a creature, and that's going to kill essentially every creature in Modern, you know, apart from the rare exceptions like, you know, Death's Shadow once it becomes very big, or really, really big but rare Eldrazi. There's a few other creatures that kind of will dodge Dismember, but very few. Most will die. It is heavy-handed. You are always paying 4 life in Temur, but sometimes you got to do it. You got to do it because we don't have much better options in our colors to destroy or get rid of creatures. And it's -5/-5, so it's not damage based, which is very important, which means it gets around indestructible as well. And yeah, I think Dismember, I don't always play it in my sideboard, but it's pretty often that I have at least one in there. Anger of the Gods, kind of like Pyroclasm, but it's even better because you're dealing 3 damage. And if the creatures die from damage from Anger of the Gods, they're exiled instead, which is actually awesome against Dredge. So if you're playing in a Dredge heavy meta, Anger of the Gods should be in your sideboard, in my opinion. Or you should maybe even at least have one of, and then have some Graveyard Hate as well. Because Graveyard Hate is great if the cards are still in their graveyard, but if they've already gone to the battlefield, you have other bigger problems. So Anger of the Gods in that case is actually doing a better job for you. So yeah, this is why I included it in here. It still sees play, and I still think it's relevant depending on the meta that you're in. Fire Spout is pretty cool. I actually prefer it over Anger of the Gods and Pyroclasm if I'm worried about a lot of going wide decks, because I can choose what kind of creature is taking damage. So if I'm playing Delver Secrets, for example, I don't want my flyers to get hit, then I'll pay the mana accordingly, so only non-flyers get hit. And most decks don't play flyers, except for humans and spirits. Mostly spirits. So again, it really depends on your meta. If you really want to protect your flyers and are not worried about the flyers of your opponent, then Fire Spout is actually a pretty cool option as opposed to Anger of Gods or Pyroclasm. Last but not least, Magmatic Sinkhole. You're almost certainly always going to pay less than 6 mana for this, and it deals 5 damage to target creature or Planeswalker. That's important. Creature or Planeswalker. And again, pretty useful. It takes out big creatures, and it could take them out potentially just for 1 CM for 1 red, which is super powerful. And it can also hit a Planeswalker if you're worried about a Planeswalker and you can't deal with them any other way. Then boom, Magmatic Sinkhole deals with them accordingly. So again, you have a lot of options. You even have more options than this in Temur that see play in Modern now, but these are the ones I want to focus on. Yeah, this is the main arsenal I go to when I want to deal with creatures, either going wide or single target. Okay, now aggro, burn, midrange. I had to put them all in here because it's kind of like a catch-all. I didn't know where else to put them. Most of these cards are life gain cards. Actually, no, wait, they're all life gain cards, but that doesn't mean that they're all the same, and you wouldn't necessarily bring them in the same scenarios. Let's go through this really quick. Life goes on. You gain 4 life. If a creature died this turn, you gain 8 life instead. If you can't play Feed the Clan with Ferocious active consistently, Life Goes On is an amazing option because all it requires is that a creature died. And if you're playing against burn, or you're playing against aggro decks, your creatures are almost certainly dying, at least one is dying, and read the wording carefully. If a creature died this turn, you gain 8 life instead. So it doesn't have to be your creatures, it could be your opponent's creatures. That's 8 life for 1 mana. That can essentially win you the game because you can do some weird combat blocking. Your opponent thinks they're going to kill you, and then all of a sudden you cast Life Goes On once the blockers are declared, and boom, you survive the turn, and then next turn you kill your opponent. I've done it. Life Goes On is awesome. I played a lot. I feel like it's not played enough in the slot of life gain, especially in Temur. Shadow Spear, man, Shadow Spear is friggin' awesome if you can get it to work and you get your creature to survive it when it's equipped and all that. You know, swinging in with a Tarmogoyf that has this, or any creature honestly that has this, is gonna be pretty awesome. Yeah, the added ability of permanence to your opponent's control, lose hexproof and indestructible, it's pretty cool. not really why you're playing Shadow Spear. It's more because you want to put this on a big creature and gain a bunch of life and also pump him. So I would bring this against burn decks and aggro decks as well, because you're going to need that life gain. If you have a 4/5 or 5/6 Tarmogoyf with this on it, and you're getting 5 life every time you swing, burn essentially will never catch up to you. Weather to Storm I see played a lot. I don't like Weather to Storm that much, but I included in here. I really don't like it because it's so conditional. It depends on the amount of spells that were cast in that same turn. So you need to wait for the eureka moment or the perfect moment to cast it to get any real value out of it. And looking at the other option, like Life Goes On, for 1 mana you could gain 8. What do you need for 2 mana to gain 9 life? So you need 2 other spells cast this turn, in the same turn before this will give you more life than Life Goes On. I don't find that to be as reliable or consistent, especially if you're waiting till the end of the game to kind of gain that life in a special scenario. I don't really like Weather to Storm that much. Feed the Clan. If you're playing a deck that consistently has creatures with 4 or more power, Feed the Clan is your best bet. 10 life is better than 8, and yes, it is 1 extra mana, but it's also 2 extra life, and that is a big deal. If you're running several Feed the Clans, you can gain 20 life and essentially reset the game for yourself. Burn will essentially concede at that point. So Feed the Clan in big creature decks, in Temur, great card. Pulse of Marasa, pretty cool card. You gain 6 life. It's 3 mana though, so you have to keep that in mind. But you get to return a card from your graveyard. You get to return a creature or land, but often usually a creature, from your graveyard and bring it into your hand. That's going to be useful against decks that A, have a lot of removal or have a lot of discard, and B, that also deal a lot of damage to you or maybe are aggro based. So Pulse of Marasa doesn't see a lot of play, but I think it can come in useful depending on your playstyle, depending on your specific Temur deck, and depending on the meta that you're in. That's why I included in here. Obstinate Baloth, you're usually bringing this against decks that play discard spells primarily. You're not necessarily bringing this in against burn. This is why it's here. So this is not necessarily an anti-burn card or an anti-aggro card. It's more of an anti-discard deck, or an anti-discard card. You know, I think it's a good option. You gain 4 life as a bonus. Usually bring this in against mid-range decks that are playing black and are playing Thoughtseize. Last but not least, Huntmaster of the Fells. I don't know where else to put him in here, but I play Huntmaster of the Fells a lot, mostly in the sideboard, and you should too. Huntmaster of the Fells is great for grindy matches. It's actually also pretty good for matches that are aggro based, like, you know, even burn, goblin. Well, maybe not goblins if they're doing the combo stuff, but just the plain old goblins. Any mid-range deck, like I said, though, you're going to be grinding out. Huntmaster of the Fells is great for grind fests. Even if it dies right away, you still gain 2 life and a 2/2 body out of it, and your opponent had to waste a spell to get rid of it. So, you know, I think Huntmaster is an awesome card. If they don't get rid of it and it flips even once, you have already tripled in value, in my opinion. So Huntmaster of the Fells is a really, really great sideboard option for those type of matches. Alright, last but not least, Control and Combo. This video went way longer than I thought. So, the spell. Counter target instant spell. Honestly, I don't know why you would play it. Mostly combo decks are playing this to just get rid of instant spells that target their cards when you're trying to combo off. So if that's the type of Temur deck that you're playing, that's when you would bring in this spell. If that's not the type of Temur deck you're playing, other counter spells are probably a better option. Ceremonious Rejection, you're going to be bringing in against Tron or any kind of deck that's playing colorless spells, because it's essentially a 1 mana counter spell at that point. So it's saying counter target colorless spell, not non-creature color spell, not creature colorless spell, just colorless spell. So it's a 1 mana counter spell against Tron, because all they play is colorless spells, or at least their payoff cards are all colorless. So I always have at least 2 in my Temur decks because it's just awesome against those decks. Veil of Summer, I mean, listen, it's still legal. So if you're playing against Control or even mid-range decks that have black, Veil of Summer is amazing. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you should know what Veil of Summer does by now, but just read it while I'm telling you about it. It's an amazing card. It stops spells from targeting you. It stops abilities like Planeswalker abilities from targeting you. You know, Mill is gonna hate you for it because they can't mill you when you cast it. Yeah, Liliana's not gonna force you to sacrifice a creature if you cast it. There are many ways you can play Veil of Summer to stop your blue opponent or your black opponent or both from doing something you don't like. So Veil of Summer, play 3 of, minimum 2, ideally 3, sometimes 4 if you have the space for it. Aether Gust, I'm still warming up to Aether Gust. It's not a counter spell per se, which is why it's good because it gets around spells like Cavern of Souls. Yeah, you're targeting a spell or a permanent that's red or green, usually bringing it in for Primeval Titan, but there are a lot of other spells or creatures that you might be able to target with Aether Gust. Again, depends on the meta, depends on the type of decks you expect to meet. That's going to be more of a meta call, but it is pretty cool because it does dodge anti-counter measures like Cavern of Souls. Disdainful Stroke is pretty awesome. I bring it in against, Tron decks. I bring it in against most control decks because they have, Cryptic Command and other big mana spells that you would be able to essentially counter with Disdainful Stroke. So again, it's a counter spell for 2 mana for anything that costs 4 or more. Very, very powerful. I usually try and include at least 1 because it kind of complements the other permission cards that I already have in my deck. I think Disdainful Stroke is pretty awesome. Negate, I mean, you have better options, but it is counter target non-creature spell for 2 mana. It's pretty powerful. At the end of the day, it's a counter spell for decks that don't play creatures. It's just a counter spell. You're essentially going to be targeting everything else. It's tried and true. It's been reprinted 1 trillion times, so it's relatively cheap. If that's something you want to be doing and you feel that's what you're missing with the other counters that you have in your deck, go for Negate. Logic Knot, hey, if you're going to be filling up your graveyard quite a bit, Logic Knot actually has a lot of value. So, delving to counter a spell is pretty powerful. You can play it early on. Even turn 2, you can play it and counter a spell, and your opponent can't do anything about it. It technically has more reach than Mana Leak in the late game, because by then your graveyard is probably pretty big, so you can counter essentially any spell because you can choose how much your opponent has to pay. But it does suffer because if you can only do it so many times, right? You are eating away at your graveyard every time you do it, so it's not something you could always do. This is why I really don't play Logic Knot, but some people do play it, and I understand why. Last but not least, Mystical Dispute. Yeah, if this was a bit more common when Astrolabe was around and all those blue control 3-color 4-color decks were running around, it's still relevant because if you are playing against a blue heavy deck, this comes in at just 1 CMC and acts as a mana leak, but it's just 1 CMC. So that's pretty powerful. Again, definitely a meta call more than anything else. I don't usually play with it because again, it's a counter spell that has condition, and it's not a full-on counter even if you meet the conditions. So it's a bit of a toss-up there. It's not my style, but it's perfectly legitimate card. And that does it for my first sideboard deck, or my first sideboard tech. If you're still here after all this time, tell me, put a comment in the comment section down below. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put your name down on a piece of paper somewhere. I'm gonna be like, this dude or this dudette stayed 48 minutes to listen to me talk about sideboard cards. So I'm gonna wait and see how many of you actually do that in the comment section down below. I hope it's more than 0, or else I'm gonna look like an idiot. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Twitter. All those stuff really helps me out a lot. It's simple for you, but it means a lot to me. A big thank you to all my patrons. Thank you for being there early on, supporting me. If you're interested in becoming a patron, check out the link in the description. Thanks, and have a good one.